Welcome, everyone. It is quite a pleasure to see a group of folks sitting in a lecture hall watching a live human being give a talk. It's been a long time. I was just saying that I think it's been a solid 2 years since we've done one of these live in-person presentations. So I'll revel in the moment of having this in-person conversation. Welcome. My name is Josh Owen. I am the director of the Vigneri Center and the Vigneri Distinguished Professor of Design. It is a great pleasure to host today's Design Encounters presentation. Design Encounters is the lecture platform that we have set up through the Vigneri Center to take advantage of visitors who are passing through the center, who can share their knowledge and wisdom with our cohort. And the Design Encounters platform allows us not to have to do a lot of planning, to, as I said, to take advantage on short notice. We're lucky to have Peter Lloyd here with us today, and Peter, I should say, before I read his formal bio, is a friend of the Vigneri Center. His last visit was shortly after the center was put up, and we're delighted to have him back with us, digging into the archives a bit with Jennifer Whitlock, our archivist, and delighted to have the opportunity to hear about his current work, which impacts so much of our study. Peter B. Lloyd is a professional software designer who has collected maps of subway systems from around the world for 25 years. Inspired by the elegance and ingenuity of the maps, he embarked on a project to document the history of New York City's subway map. Based on interviews of the people who have been involved in designing the subway map since the 1960s, on archival searches, and on the marketplace of transit memorabilia, he's assembled primary materials that map out the evolution of the map. Vigneri Transit Maps was published by RIT Press in 2012. The sequel, Geography Bites Back, will be self-published in 2022. His publications on subway maps and philosophy can be found on his personal website, peterbloyd.com. I want to also mention that the RIT book, the RIT Press book that was published, as I just mentioned, will be here with us on a cart just outside the lecture hall when we're finished with the lecture. Representative from the RIT Press will be there, so if anyone's interested in purchasing a copy and perhaps encouraging Peter to give it a signature, now would be a good time to do it after the lecture is over. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you very much for everyone to come along. It's a pleasure and an honor to be back here. This talk is focused on one very straightforward question, and the answer to it is also quite straightforward, but it's a bit complicated getting to the answer. Yes. So probably most of you are familiar with Massimo Vigneri's map. This was produced in 1972 and was proudly announced by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, and here we see William Ronan, who was the chairman of the MTA, unveiling it in one of the subway stations. Now this map was hailed as a design classic, but it did not last very long. In just 7 years, it was replaced by a completely different map, a different design, a different ethos. And the question I want to address is why? Why, after the MTA embraced Vigneri's map so enthusiastically, was it discarded and replaced by the diametric opposite? And how did this replacement process carry on and who was driving it. Now, obviously, as students, you know that when you start off on a project, you do a literature review. So the starting point here would be to do a literature review, see what people have said about the reason for changing from Vigneri's map to the geographic style map. So let's just have a quick look through some of the publications. This is Mark Tribe in the Design Quarterly in 1980. It is difficult to believe that there was such a negative reaction to this map of many strengths. The New York City subway map, designed by the office of Massimo Vigneri, a map that has been the cause of many riders' frustrations. In response to user complaints, the Vigneri map has been superseded by a new map, which at first seems quite old-fashioned. So Mark is there ascribing the reason for the change to people's complaints, that the riders didn't like the Vigneri map. Mark Ovenden in Transit Maps of the World, one of the most widely purchased books on subway maps. Many New Yorkers complained that the attention to geometry made Vigneri's map confusing to use. For example, 50th Street and Broadway appears west of 50th Street and 8th Avenue, when in reality it's east. So, in 1975, the MTA formed a committee to revise the map. The result, a major shift back to topography, was published in 1979 and has stabilized the design ever since. Stephen Heller in the New York Times. Blah, blah, blah. Dissatisfaction was palpable, and in 1979, the map was replaced. Alice Rawsthorne, again in the New York Times. No sooner had the Metropolitan Transportation Authority introduced a new map of the New York subway system on August 7th, 1972, wrong date, but never mind, then complaints flooded in. In 1979, the MTA bowed to public pressure by replacing his diagrammatic map with a geographical one. Mark Burns, City Lab 2014. In the case of the 1972 MTA map, the design was quickly rejected by many of the city's everyday commuters and replaced with a more literal interpretation of the system's layout in 1979. Steve Heller again. Massimo Vigneri's 1971, wrong year, subway map was such a brilliant failure. Vigneri's transit opus was harshly criticized at the time and ultimately doomed by the authority that commissioned it. Soon after it was put into effect, Vigneri's diagram was slammed for not being literal enough. The water was not blue, the parks were not green. The map was replaced in 1979. Now, it's said that New Yorkers have an extra chromosome for being blunt and direct, and that is certainly true of Concetta Benciviga. New Yorkers hated it. Well, this review of the literature is very definite, it's very damning, and it says that Vigneri's map was a dud. I beg to differ. Because this narrative first appears after the map had been replaced by the geographic one. And you'd have thought that if there's a great upwelling of complaints about Vigneri's map, somebody would have noticed at the time, and not just after the event. The first reference to this narrative that I found is from Mark Tribe, who, as we saw earlier, blamed complaints from the riders for the jettisoning of the map. I emailed him to ask, why did he conclude in 1980 that that was the reason for getting rid of Vigneri's map? And he said, well, public reaction could have caused the actions of the MTA. Otherwise, why would they change the map? There had to be a reason for that action, some source of their information. And I think that was a common line of thought for many people who, upon finding that the MTA had thrown away Vigneri's map and replaced it with a geographic one, without any explanation being given by the MTA as to why they'd done this, assumed, well, there must be some reason for it. What other reason could there be? People must have complained. And so that idea took root, became published, got into the New York Times, and hence became authoritative. And it's been doing the rounds ever since. Oh, pardon me. So let's look at the anatomy of this, what I call the popular narrative. The first premise is that Vigneri's map was the first diagram of the New York City subway. Secondly, that New Yorkers found the Vigneri map harder to use than previous maps, hence the complaints, supposedly. That this level of complaint drove the MTA, that this dissatisfaction drove a large number of complaints, and that in turn drove the MTA to make a new map. Was Vigneri's map the first diagrammatic map of the New York City subway? Well, let's have a look. This is Andrew Hagstrom's geographic style map, which was a gold standard from 1936 to 1967. That was followed, and it was adopted as the official map in 1943 to 56. So it was, although it was privately designed, it was adopted by the Transit Authority as their official map for a while. Now, in 1956, the Transit Authority commissioned George Salomon to design a new map, which became published in 58. Now, you'll notice uncannily similar to Vigneri's map. It's a diagram. And there's a limited way of doing a diagram of the New York City subway if you're going to limit yourself to horizontal and vertical lines and 45-degree diagonals. So this is 1958. In 67, the map was changed from a three-color scheme to a multi-color scheme, but still the same geometry, still the same diagrammatic form. And then eventually, 72, Vigneri's map came out. So it actually had been 15 years of diagrams in people's pockets as they rode the subway before Massimo's map came out. So we can cross off this first premise of the popular narrative, the idea that Vigneri's map was the first diagram. It wasn't. People had already been using the map, using a diagrammatic map. And therefore, we can also dismiss the second premise. One diagram is pretty much like any other diagram. How can it be so difficult to follow Vigneri's diagram when people have already been using diagrams to navigate the subway for a decade and a half? Now, the third premise is that there was an increase in complaints about Vigneri's map. Well, where are they? Where are these complaints? In 1975, the New York Times did a survey of people's complaints and objections about the subway system. And they found that the high fare and the service cuts were the main problems people had with the MTA, and no mention at all of the design of the map. It simply didn't come onto the radar. 1977, the Daily News in New York ran a telephone poll of people who could phone in and say what they hated about the MTA or what they thought the MTA could do to improve the service. And there's a whole stack, there's a whole page of things, and the map appears right at the very bottom, least important topic, and the objection is, I suggest the Transit Authority install large, readable subway maps, probably near token booths, as they will not be vandalized. Nothing about Vigneri's design. Nobody phoned in and said, I can't read this map, it's so abstract. It didn't occur on people's radar. Every month, the MTA was required to submit a tabulation of complaints that it had received from riders to the governor of the state of New York. Only a few of those months of records are still available in the municipal archives, and they don't mention the map. The most commonly given complaint is general train service, followed by timetable, equipment. Another peak comes at rude train men. But nowhere in there does anyone complain about the map. Another possible source would be the New York Times itself, the letters column. After all, if anyone in New York has got something to complain about, they'll write to the New York Times. So I had a search. I found 2 letters about the design of the map during the period 72 to 79. This is the one single complaint. But the mention of the design is embedded upon other gripes. And this is from W. Dorwin Teague, 1974. For instance, the pocket subway map, if one can be found, is stylized and distorted in a misguided attempt at simplification, to the point where one can only get a very general idea of what goes where. There are no maps on the station platforms or entrances to let the rider figure out his route before he gets on the train. So this person seems to be unhappy with subways generally, doesn't like the fact they can't find a map, there's none on the station walls, and mentions also in passing that the design isn't satisfactory. And the one letter in favour of Vigneri's map from Sabina Leitzmann, who is the correspondent for a German newspaper, says clearly readable graphics. So if you can tell anything from two letters, is that opinions were divided, which I think we already know. So almost no mention of the design of the subway map in the New York Times letters. This is a comment from Eddie Jabbour, who came back to New York from London at the time of the great debate which occurred in Cooper Union, 78. And he's now a designer, the principal of the Kick Design Company that produces its own map. And he said, New Yorkers generally don't, and didn't back then, complain about either map, Vigneri or Tauranak, especially in those pre-social media days. The great map battles that we had back then were the great academic map battles, not the public map battles, as there really were none. I think this is the impression that one gets from the absence of any complaints and this comment, that most riders were more concerned about the dirt, the unreliability of the subway, rather than the map. They were already used to diagram maps. This was another one. Get on with it. But not only was there no upsurge of complaints, the map was actually very popular. The map design was imprinted on T-shirts, on tote bags, on drinking glasses, silk dresses, more tote bags, just about anything you can print a map on. And the MTA raked in $35,000 a year by selling Massimo Vigneri's map. So that kind of indicates that it wasn't unpopular. It wasn't that New Yorkers hated it. Actually, New Yorkers loved it. Not only was the map popular with the public, the Transit Authority also liked it. In 1974, the TA decided to invest in enhancing Vigneri's map. They hired Michael Hertz Associates to redraw the whole map, correcting what they regarded as defects. So first of all, they expanded the map eastwards. Let's see if this works. So here you can see 71 Street, Continental Avenue has moved over here. So everything shifted towards the east. All the other stations are moved eastwards. So that whole part of the map moves to the east to use up a large section of empty space on the original map, which obviously requires quite a bit of effort, time and money, to redraw the entire Vigneri map. And the font was changed from the famous Helvetica to Trade Gothic, which is more open and legible. It may not be as theoretically attractive, but it was deemed to be more readable by the riders of the subway. Again, that meant all the text had to be rewritten. And also these odd things like 50th Street Broadway, which Vigneri put here, 50th Street Broadway, when physically it's on the other side. And so here we see it's been moved. As far as Vigneri was concerned, this wasn't a mistake because this is an abstract diagram. It doesn't matter whether a station on one side or other of an avenue. It's only if you want to use the subway map to walk around the city that you're going to get confused. Anyway, the Transit Authority invested time and money into making these corrections, and this, I believe, indicates that they intended to keep it. So as far as 1974 was concerned, the Transit Authority had accepted the map, they were going to run with it, improve it, and develop it. Also, they were building up a family of other maps around it, the Commuter Railway Map and a series of bus maps, and proudly displaying this as a coherent body of information delivery for the riders. The Commuter Rail Map was designed by Joan Charrison, who previously worked with Massimo Vigneri, came out in 1974, building up a system of diagrammatic maps for rail users. And the bus maps follow a similar style. So the direction of travel of the Transit Authority was clearly to keep the map, improve it, and go forwards with it. So this suggests a different narrative from the popular one. Popular narrative says that the 72 map was revolutionary, that subway riders immediately hated it, and the riders pressured the MTA into replacing it in 79. My proposed new narrative is that 72 map was an evolution of earlier diagrams. The map was very popular and drove merchandise sales. The Transit Authority invested in it to improve it, and it was seen as an integral part of information provision. And then something changed in 1975 that led them to jettison this seemingly successful map. The basic sequence of events is 72, the map is launched, September, 74, it's redrawn, 74, the Commuter Rail Map comes out. And then, from 75 onwards, there's a different tune. April 75, there's a proposed Hagstrom lookalike replacement map. Remember, Hagstrom was the map I showed you earlier that was very geographic from the 1930s. And the Transit Authority seriously considered going back to 1930s style. July 75, the Subway Map Committee was formed under the TA, the Transit Authority. In June of the following year, the committee was transferred to the MTA. 78, January, a prototype map was shown at City Anna Gallery using just red lines. Another prototype with red and blue lines in Cooper Union in April 78. And then finally, June 79, the new map was released. So there's a break point at 75. Something happened to change the happy state of the Vigneri map. What happened? What happened was David Unish. So the original chairman of the MTA, William Ronan, from 68 to 74, resigned, and he was replaced by David Unish, the new chairman, the new mastermind of the MTA. Now, he'd come from Macy's, where he'd worked for 33 years, absorbing the retail mentality, the idea you want to sell things, you want to market things, and he said in his inaugural address that he was open to examining any innovative marketing idea for the subway, and that transit marketing is not too different from marketing shirts or automobiles. So he wanted to bring his psychological approach from Macy's to the MTA. And he said, you'll be seeing all kinds of promotions to attract transit riders, a people-to-people approach, relating to the community. People-to-people programs will include new maps for the public, improved marking for the buses and bus stops, and a campaign for courtesy, including signs to be stenciled in subway trains that will say, thanks for riding. So clearly he's putting up a marker saying, we're going to change the maps. The maps are going to be part of our marketing campaign. Now, there had been attempts to begin to market the subway under Ronan. This is from the annual report from 73, just before David Unish came in. And this is either Ronan or one of his representatives writing. An all-out effort to improve the dissemination of information to riders and potential riders, and to begin to more aggressively market the MTA service, was undertaken in mid-1973. An interagency marketing committee was established and immediately adopted a conservative building block approach to the authority's marketing effort, operating under the little steps for little feet philosophy. The first development was a modest program to improve dissemination of transit information throughout the MTA. But instead of Ronan's little steps for little feet, Unish wanted a giant leap in marketing. So there was already marketing going on in the MTA, but Unish wanted to take it to a new level, bring in the sort of ideas that have been successful in Macy's. William Allison, who was the chief executive officer for Unish, expanded the marketing committee into a full-blown marketing department, fully staffed, choosing its first director, Claire McCarthy, who had already been in public affairs at the MTA. And transit marketing was a new concept at the time, struggling to find workable methods. And in 1975, Claire McCarthy went to the inaugural National Transit Marketing Conference, where lots of new ideas were bandied around how to market transit systems to people. Between 75 and 79, certain ideas developed, and they were summarized in this conference in 79, where there was a new philosophy of subway marketing. And one of the conclusions in that conference in 79 is that system maps should have these primary goals. Number one, to promote ridership in general and increase off-peak ridership, etc. This is a revolutionary change. The map is no longer a navigation aid primarily. It's no longer there to help find your way around the subway. It's there to sell seats. It's there to get you to go on the subway. It's a marketing tool. And that change of perspective is going to change the priority of how you design the map and what kinds of maps you want to use. David Eunice brought in one of his colleagues, former colleagues from Macy's, Fred Wilkinson. He created a new role for him and embedded him in the Transit Authority. I need to explain a little bit about the strange politics of the Transit Authority in New York. Originally, the Transit Authority was created in 1953 to run the subway. In 1968, a parent organization, the MTA, was created above it. Obviously, a certain amount of resentment in the TA, because suddenly they were finding they weren't the masters of the subway anymore. They had to take orders from the MTA. But the map still belonged to the Transit Authority. So that's a bit frustrating for David Eunice. If he wanted to use the map for marketing, he had to get control of it, to wrest control of it from the Transit Authority. So he's at the top of the MTA, and he's got the problem of how to influence the map to make it more of a marketing tool. So he inserts Fred Wilkinson into the TA. He's hired by David Eunice, but inserted and working in the TA in November 74. And shortly afterwards, Fred Wilkinson gets one of his men to create a new geographic map based on the old Hagstrom map. Wasn't very successful. And a few months later, created the Subway Map Committee. And 76, he left to go to another part of the Transit Authority. What was achieved in that year and a half of work by the Subway Map Committee in terms of replacing the Vigneri map with something that's going to market the system? Not very much. This is one of the prototype maps. It's a bit skimpy. It's a bit blurred. It's a bit blurred because this is a scan of the 35mm slide. This is all we have left of this particular map. It's a 3-color map, which is guaranteed not to work for 2 reasons. First of all, at this time, all of the routes of the subway had their own colors. If you then try and replace that with a 3-color map, people are going to get confused. For example, here we have a red line. Well, how does that relate to the train that has a red marker on? It doesn't. Secondly, there's this peculiar thing called the Christie Street connection that connects between the BMT line in red and the green IND line. So a train that travels from one to the other, is that a red train or a green train? It's neither, because that classification of those 3 operating companies had ceased to be applicable in 1967. So we're trying to go back to a 3-color scheme is doomed to failure. They were, in effect, chasing unicorns, impossible entities. There was no map along these lines that could ever work. Now, in parallel to Fred Wilkinson struggling to work this magic with the unicorn of the 3-color map, there's also work going on in the new marketing department. Besides printing out dresses and tote bags with the Vigneri map, they created a new guide to New York. which of course included a map. Now, this is the business. This is the thing that's going to sink the Vigneri map. It's not a toy map like the one that Fred Wilkinson's committee was producing. This is a map, fully working map with lots of details, with little route markers, those circles with numbers and letters in, indicate which route of the subway is running along that particular line. Because all the lines, as you can see, are drawn in red. One of the problems with this map is obviously it's confusing because all the lines are the same color. The other problem is it's gigantic. So in order to cover the whole of New York, we need page after page after page after page, which isn't going to work if you want a pocket map. You can unfold and see where you're going on the subway system. So there are two snags. Although this map is now a contender against the Vigneri map, it's got two snags. One is the red lines, and the other is it's too big. Now let's pause and consider who is responsible for this new map in the Seeing New York guidebook. It's a guy called John Tauranak. How did he get involved? And this photograph on the left is from the debate in '78 with Massimo Vigneri and John Tauranak. Now, John was a tour guide working for a long time with the Architectural Society, and he was engaged to produce these booklets for the MTA's culture bus. This is a bus that ran around all the cultural sites in New York, and he was hired because of his skill and knowledge of New York's architecture and history to write the guidebooks. These are two books with little paragraphs of quirky facts about each point where the bus is going to stop. And because of his success in writing those booklets, the MTA hired him to write and design this entire booklet, Seeing New York, including the new map. So this is a marketing exercise by the MTA, but it gave John Tauranak an opportunity to create the kind of map he wanted. He did not like Vigneri's map. He said that it was an insult to the city. For example, that Central Park is a grey blob in Vigneri's map. And John Tauranak wanted to observe what he called the cartographic verities, that parks should be green, water should be blue, and so on. And he was able to do that in this map, in this guidebook, because of his experience of doing guided tours and writing about them. So going back to this diagram, we have Fred Wilkinson leaving the Subway Map Committee, but John Tauranak, having completed that guidebook, then joins the committee and takes it over in June '77. The side effect of this is that ownership of the subway map now moves from the Transit Authority to the MTA. The MTA having since captured the subway map. And here we have really the answer to the original question as to why was the Vigneri map jettisoned and replaced with a geographic map. It's a combination of two forces. One is the MTA needing to have a map that could be used as a marketing tool, coming from David Unish and his marketing background, and John Tauranak, who wanted what he called a didactic map, one which would describe the city, where the parks are, where the water is, where all the streets are. And this underlying force from the MTA for a marketing map created an opportunity for John to do his thing and get a didactic map. Because changing the map is not a cheap thing. It will cost eventually millions of dollars. And John couldn't do this on his own. He's just a marketing consultant. He can say, oh, let's spend a huge amount of money on this. The funding for this came from the MTA's need for a marketing tool, but it gave John the opportunity to move towards his style of geographic map. Now, as I mentioned, there are two problems with this map. One is the red lines, the other is the fact that it's too big. At this time, beginning of 1977, Michael Hertz Associates hired a sculptor and painter, Nobu Ceresi, as the artistic director of the subway map project. And his first task was to redraw the land masses of New York. So he deformed the city. Manhattan became fatter than it really is. Brooklyn is twisted around to fit into the space, so the whole thing fits into a pocketable map, unlike that huge long thing we saw earlier. So much for the making the map fit. What about the red lines? Here, a fortuitous intervention from Phyllis Surf Wagner came along. She's a former actress and wife of the former mayor, Robert Wagner. Now, she was appointed chair of the new MTA Aesthetics Committee, which is mostly concerned with redecorating stations and making everything look aesthetic. In September 78, she inquires of John Tauranak, "How is the map project going?" "Dead in the water," was John's reply. Why? For the reasons we've already seen. The red line map is too confusing, but there were no funds available to change it to a trunk colour scheme. So Mrs. Wagner said, "Well, show me a sketch of a possible way of doing these trunk lines, and I'll see what I can do." Mrs. Wagner, although she had no elected or official role within the MTA, was very influential, having been a socialite for the political classes in New York for many years. So she was in a position to pull strings. So over the following weekend, Nobu Ceresi, the Japanese sculptor we met, drew out 4 different schemes of how you could change the colours of the map from the old 3-colour scheme or the old route colour scheme into a new scheme where each trunk going down Manhattan had a single colour and the branches took on the same colour. For example, Lexington Avenue became one colour and all its branches the same colour. The point being that then you do not need 14 different lines going down Manhattan, just one line for each trunk, hence allowing us to have a geographic map. By September the 8th, 78, this had been rapidly approved by both MTA and TA, and on that date, the fate of the Vigneri map was sealed, because the 2 problems that had been faced, the red lines and not fitting into the map sheet, had been resolved by Nobu Ceresi, and John Tauranak could now go ahead with creating his new map. This just explains the trunk colours, so we can see that the red line here is Lexington Avenue, and that splits off into its different branches. Now in Vigneri's map, each of those branches would be a different colour. Each end-to-end route was its own colour. In the trunk scheme, there's one colour for the trunk, and that's taken by the branches. And I would argue that Ceresi's curved lines are as elegant in their own way as Massimo's straight lines are. It's a different kind of beauty, different kind of elegance, but I think that this is part of what makes the map a contender against Vigneri's map. So that solves these 2 problems that were blocking progress from the Vigneri map to the geographic map, the deformed land masses and the trunk colours. The result, in June 79, was this geographic map in great detail. And this just zooms into the downtown area, showing how Nobu's sketches were translated into the finished product. And as John Tauranak said, if there's any beauty at all in this map, it comes from Nobu Ceresi's drawing. So, conclusions. 1, the Vigneri subway map was not a revolutionary new design. It was a systematic improvement on earlier diagrammatic maps. It was not rejected by subway riders, but was popular with the general public and accepted by the transit authority. The push to replace it came from the new chairman's desire to market the subway more aggressively because of the oil crisis and New York City's fiscal crisis. Basically, the city was almost bankrupt. The specific form of the new geographic map was led by John Tauranak's vision of a didactic map and implemented by Nobu Ceresi's artistry and the work of the whole subway map committee. 2 more general observations. Maps and all other artifacts are not necessarily designed for the benefit of the end user. In any capitalist economy, they're often designed to serve the purposes of marketing. So it's not necessarily the case that the geographic map is better than Vigneri's map. It was brought in to serve a marketing purpose and not necessarily to make it easier to navigate the subway. Secondly, replacing a popular myth with a narrative that's based on historical evidence is possible only with archives. Archives provide a ground truth of history which we urgently need in this post-truth era. And all the material that I've shown here is included in this book, which hopefully will come out later this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. We have a few minutes for questions if there are any.
Do you want to wait for the microphone? Sorry. Yeah, but it has to be recorded as well. Thank you.
Thank you for all this insightful backstory. So I'm curious about, so that do they then marketing aspect, do they succeed on what they trying to do, like from this new map? What happened after launching the map?
The situation in New York improved considerably, not just because of the map. There were a number of marketing programs to make New York seem more appealing to tourists and for investors. And there was also more money made available by the federal government at the same time to improve the transport system, to repair the trains, repair the tracks. So in reaction to the crisis in the mid-70s, a lot of things happened, one of which was the map. Now, whether the map or how much difference the map actually made in terms of bringing riders into the system, we can't tell. We'd have to run an experiment and actually just make one change to the New York City and not the other changes. This is the problem with trying to interpret cause and effect in historical context. There are many things happening at the same time, and you can't pull out the effect of one. But certainly, the ridership increased considerably and continued increasing until the 1990s. The city got better. Everything was working again as it had been. So we can only guess as to how much effect that map made. Yeah, the idea of having a dynamic representation of the positions of trains is wonderful. I think we all like to know when we're standing on a platform, where the heck is the train? Is it going to come today, or should I just go home and not bother? So I think that having that up-to-date information presented in a clear graphical way is a big leap forward. The cartography of that map, however, I think suffers certain weaknesses. It's not it's presented as an amalgam between Vigneri-style diagram and geographic map, but it isn't really. It kind of falls between the two stools. So there's an element of diagrammaticity there. Some of the lines don't actually follow the geographical location they're really running at, but also the lines are often drawn very narrowly, so that you can't see them clearly as you can with the standard MTA map. There is a lot of work going on in different styles of maps. Elie Jabot, that I mentioned earlier, has a map which in a way does something similar of bringing in geographical elements like neighborhoods into a map that is basically a Vigneri-style geometry. So I think there's a lot of scope for moving forwards with hybrid maps, maps which combine diagrammatic element with geographic element, especially when they're electronic, so that as you zoom down or click, you can actually get full geographic information on top of the diagram or flipping over from the diagram. The use of digital maps really transforms the whole game. A lot of the debates about the Vigneri versus Tauranak committee maps were about paper maps. And once we move into the digital era, it opens up a whole new arena of possibilities of things that can go wrong, things that can go right. And one of the elements of this has to be usability studies. There's a guy called Maxwell Roberts in the University of Essex in the UK who's really leading with objective studies of subway maps, of creating experimental variants, getting people to use them, and then measuring how many mistakes they make, how quickly they can navigate. I think that is important in evaluating all these new kinds of hybrid maps, which we hopefully will be getting, rather than relying purely on design's own intuition. Funnily enough, one of the things that both Massimo Vigneri and John Tauranak had in common is an anti-democratic instinct as far as maps are concerned. John said the only good committee is a committee of one. And Massimo Vigneri said there's no democracy in map making. The designer dictates what the map is going to be. I can understand where that's coming from, but it has to be tempered with objective studies of usability. So sorry, it's a long answer to your question about the new working co-map. I think it's in some ways a step forward, but there's so much more needs to be done in evaluating and developing these kinds of maps.
What did Vignelli have to say about all the changes to his original design?
I mean, the changes in 1974.
And
He
then
said they
all
should
the
have come.
changes after that.
Sorry?
And the changes after that to his original design.
I'm not sure what you're referring to as the second one, because Massimo created his map in 72 and then wasn't given any further involvement in it. He wanted to. He said that as you have found these so-called defects in the map, like 50th Street and Broadway, why not come back to the original designer, him, and get them fixed? So he resented the fact that he wasn't involved in those corrections. Now, with regard to, do you mean the more recent things with 2012 and what he was involved in that?
Oh, I mean,
shortly
in the
before he passed.
70s.
Sorry?
In the 70s when they changed everything again.
Oh, you mean with this geographic map? Oh, he hated it. He said he wanted to vomit when he saw that. And both John and Massimo had a very visceral reaction to each other's maps. I think they respected each other as worthy opponents of people who were genuinely concerned to create a map that's best for the city, but their views of each other's work were very hostile. And one of the things I found in my research is that talking to some people who claim to have more of an influence in the map than they really had, they often just say, well, that was a job I did. But Massimo and John both had a passionate concern, a sense of ownership of their map throughout their lives. And when the MTA started to bring in the Weekender map, which is done with Massimo Vigneri and his associates, Yoshiko Waterhouse and Beatrice Juventus, I told John about this. I said, well, they're bringing Vigneri's map back in. And he exploded with words I can't use in a public place, stormed off and took several minutes to regain his composure. And that's an indication of how deeply he felt that the Vigneri map was hateful. And likewise with Massimo, he always hated. He said, this is crazy. There's no system in it. There's no rationality, which is true. It's not meant to be a systematic map. It's a map that comes out of a sense of love for the city. It's an emotional map. So, yeah, I think that they both totally believed in their own maps.
Hi. I was just curious, for Cerezi's map specifically, once you get the colored trunks, especially in the downtown area where it gets more complex, you have to pick what's on top and what's on bottom. And I was curious if you knew kind of the thought process that went into those lines.
You mean, so for example, with Lexington Avenue, there were three colours and that went to one. And your question is, why did they choose that one colour?
No, more of like if you see in like downtown Brooklyn, there's a bunch of lines that like all cross, but like there are lines that have to be on top of the
Right,
other.
yes.
And
Yeah, I see what
how
you
they
mean.
decided that.
I don't know. Noble Cerezi made that decision himself, and unfortunately he's passed away, so I can't ask him. But I guess it would have. He did a large number of different sketches, so I imagine he tried it different ways and then judged which way was clearer or which way was more elegant. And I guess sometimes it wouldn't make any difference one way or the other. But he certainly, I've seen his sketches for the DeKalb area where he's tried it with different permutations of being one above, one below. So he certainly investigated all those possibilities, but what his criterion was, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Given that this map is more geographic in nature and less artistic than Massimo's original map, did these show up on like the mugs and the t-shirts and the dresses? Was that able to replicate, or was this still so functional that it never kind of migrated and bridged that gap in the marketing efforts?
It certainly was printed on all these artifacts. How successful that was, I don't know. I've only found the information about the revenue from the Vigneri period, so I don't know whether sales plummeted when they started putting this map onto mugs. I guess we'd have to ask the MTA marketing, but I guess it's commercial information.
I was curious if there was a response when the new map came out in '79. Was there reader, response or rider feedback?
Not much. There were a number of editorials which praised the map in terms of the new amount of information being provided, but there was no great upsurge of letters either way again. So it's just that people just get on with their lives and don't really. I mean, if they don't like a map, they're just going to mutter about it. Part of the problem is that the subway itself is very difficult to navigate, whatever map you've got. It's a very complex system, so having one map or another doesn't make a huge difference in your ability to navigate the system if you're being stumped by, for example, weekend changes. Part of the design of the map that came out was the service table. The top right-hand corner, there's a table of service patterns which change in the evening and on weekends. And eventually the MTA withdrew that on the grounds that it was so unreliable, because so often there would be engineering works on weekends that they said it gave people a false sense of security, thinking they know what trains are going to run. So they have to go online to get the updated information. So I think that the subway system itself is such a big problem to navigate, and the map is only one part of it. It doesn't really excite people enough to complain about it or to write letters to the papers.
Thank you. You hinted at electronic maps, and I was wondering what subway systems in the world are using them now, and how close is New York to having an electronic map, and do any of those maps have real-time links to information like when the next train is coming? Thank you.
Yes, well, certainly New York does, but the MTA doesn't want to get too involved in building apps with electronic maps. They're happy to supply the information in digital form for developers to create their own apps that take the information and present it. So they're kind of allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom. Lots of different companies can come forward, as Work & Co did, take the data feeds from the MTA and create their own user interface. Likewise, Eddie Joua's Kick Map uses real-time information. So there are digital maps available now, a number of them, which take real-time information from the MTA and present it in different formats. I don't know what other cities are doing that, but I think it's, I don't know which other cities actually provide a real-time data feed for app designers to use. So, sorry, could you wait for the mic just so it can be recorded? Thank you.
Curious, you're a software designer, right?
Yes.
How did you get into this historical side of the map?
By accident. Many years ago, I was working in a part of London near to a market called Spitalfields Market, where they sold lots of antiques and interesting memorabilia. And one of my colleagues, and there's also a food market with food from around the world, but they only took cash in those days. And my colleague wanted to get his lunch, so I lent him a few quid. And the next day he said, "Do you want the money back, or would you like a mystery gift?" So of course I went for the mystery gift, which turned out to be a map of the London tube system from 1958, held together with Scotch tape. And I found it fascinating to study this and see how the system had changed and in what way it was the same. And I started looking around old bookshops and jumble sales trying to find any more old subway maps or tube maps. And I couldn't find any until one day I went onto eBay for something else, and there they all were. Londoners throw away their tube maps because they're ephemeral, but tourists keep them, put them in the attic, die, and then their kids sell them off. So all of the old subway maps are there on eBay, mostly not in the UK. Likewise for other cities. I started collecting them from New York, Berlin, Moscow, anywhere. And then I started laying them out on the table to see how the patterns changed and why in 1979 did New York change from a diagram to a geographic one. And I put up a website enumerating my conclusions about who might have designed one map or another map. And I wrote down that 1979, this was John Tauranak's map, and I received a very irate email from Michael Hertz. He said, no, I designed it. And this led on to really going down the rabbit hole of contacting people, interviewing people, looking through memos in the Transit Museum to discover what really happened in the 70s, which took quite a few years of digging, chasing people around, hunting people down, interviewing them. And now I think I do at last have a fairly complete story of all the things that happened in the 70s to produce the new map. So yeah, it starts off by accident and then developed the momentum, and now I've got to see it through, not just this volume, but quite quixotically, probably another 8 volumes. Because the New York subway system has been here since 1904, and the map is quite fascinating in all its decades.
And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.